Imagine you've just landed at Charles de Gaulle Airport. You're expecting the fantasy. You're expecting the France of Louis Vuitton ads, endless café terraces, and a work-life balance that makes American capitalism look like a penal colony. You think you're entering a wealthy superpower, but you're wrong. You're stepping into a country that is quietly, politely, and steadily going broke. A country where factory closures are doubling factory openings, where the government hasn't balanced a budget in 50 consecutive years, and where the interest payments on the national debt are about to eclipse what they spend on educating their children. The croissants are still good, but the economics? They're terrifying. Welcome to the reality of the French decline. Here's why France is actually poorer than you realize. Let's start with a number that no one is talking about. 82. That's the number of factory closures in France in the first half of 2025. Now, compare that to the number of new factories that opened in the same period. 44. Let that sink in for a second. For every factory that opened, nearly 2 closed their doors. This is not a country building its future. This is a country liquidating its past. And here's the kicker. This is happening while Germany, just across the border, saw a net gain of 25 industrial sites. France isn't just losing ground, it's hemorrhaging it. But that number, 82 closures, is just the symptom. The disease runs much, much deeper. And by the end of this, you're going to understand why France is not the wealthy European giant you think it is. It's a warning sign for what's coming to the rest of the West. Now, I know what you're thinking. France has Louis Vuitton. It has Chanel. It's the #1 tourist destination on Earth. How can it be poor? That's the brilliant illusion. France has mastered the art of looking rich while acting broke. It's like the aristocrat who still lives in the castle but can't afford to heat it. They wear the velvet robes, but they're shivering underneath. Because while Paris is selling €3,000 handbags to American tourists, the rest of the country is fighting over crumbs. While the Eiffel Tower sparkles every night, the French middle class is quietly evaporating. And while Emmanuel Macron gives speeches about European sovereignty, his government is sitting on a debt bomb that would make Italy blush. This matters to you because France is not an anomaly, it's a preview. It's showing you exactly what happens when a wealthy Western democracy runs out of road, when the math stops working, when 50 years of overspending finally comes due. So, pay attention because the French disease is contagious, and your country might already be infected. Let me take you inside the mechanism of how France got here. Picture this. It's 1974. ABBA is topping the charts. Nixon just resigned, and France passes its last balanced budget. That's right. For 50 consecutive years, half a century, the French government has spent more money than it earned, every single year. Left-wing governments, right-wing governments, centrists, it doesn't matter. The addiction to spending is bipartisan. It's pathological. Where does the money go? It's not going into infrastructure. Bridges are crumbling. It's not going into the military. They're relying on NATO. It's going into social protection. France spends a staggering 32 to 34% of its GDP on social spending. That is the highest in the world, higher than Sweden, higher than Denmark. It is a welfare state on steroids. Now, don't get me wrong, it's nice to have a safety net. It's great that no one dies in the street from lack of insulin. But this level of spending is mathematically unsustainable when your economy isn't growing. And that's the core problem. France is paying for a Rolls-Royce welfare state with a Peugeot economy. In 2025, France's GDP growth is projected at just 0.6%. That's not a typo, 0.6. Compare that to the Eurozone average of 1.3%. France is growing at half the speed of its neighbors. And it gets worse. Manufacturing output stagnating, projected at 0% growth through the end of 2025. Foreign trade, subtracting 0.7 points from growth. The French economy is not expanding, it's treading water. And all the while, the debt keeps piling up. By 2024, France's public debt hit 113% of GDP. To put that in perspective, the European Union rules, the famous Maastricht criteria, say you're supposed to keep debt under 60%. France hasn't seen 60% since the internet was invented, and it's not getting better. Projections show debt rising to 114.9% in 2025, 116.5% in 2026, and 120% by 2027. This is a country on a fiscal treadmill, running faster and faster just to stay in place. And here's where it gets truly terrifying. The interest payments on that debt, the money France has to pay just to service what it already owes, is about to become one of the largest items in the national budget. In 2025, interest payments will hit 2.5% of GDP. That's 67 billion euros. By 2029, it's projected to reach 3% of GDP. And in a crisis scenario, which is looking more likely every day, it could hit 4% by 2030. Let me translate that for you. France will soon spend more money paying off past mistakes than it spends educating its future children. That is not the sign of a wealthy country. That is the sign of a country in quiet, polite, irreversible decline. And the worst part, the French public has no idea. They still think they live in a superpower. They still think the state can afford to give them everything. But the math is screaming a different story. The correction is coming. The only question is when. But that was just the warm-up. The real danger is what happens next. Because France isn't just broke on paper. It's broke in the real economy. The part you can see and touch. Let me show you what I mean. If you drive 2 hours north of the luxury boutiques of Paris, you enter a different world. This is the Rust Belt of France, the Hauts-de-France, the Grand Est. This is where the ghost of French industry lives. You see, we have this image of France as an industrial powerhouse. We think of Airbus, nuclear power plants, high-speed trains. And yes, those exist, but they are the remnants of a glorious past, not the indicators of a vibrant present. Here's the brutal truth. France doesn't make things anymore. Manufacturing now accounts for barely 10% of France's GDP. Compare that to Germany, where it's nearly double that, or Italy, or even Poland. France has deindustrialized faster and harder than almost any other Western nation. Why? Because for 40 years, French policy was obsessed with the idea of a post-industrial society. The geniuses in Paris decided that factories were dirty and old-fashioned. They wanted France to be a nation of consultants, designers, and luxury brand managers. They bet everything on services and tourism. They bet on becoming the museum of the world. And it worked for the tourists. France is the #1 tourist destination on Earth. But you can't build a superpower on waiters and tour guides. The consequences are devastating. When you lose factories, you lose the high-paying blue-collar jobs that sustain the middle class. When those jobs go to Poland or China, the towns die. The bakery closes, the school shrinks, the doctor retires and isn't replaced. This is the fuel for the political rage you see on the news. When you see the yellow vests, the gilets jaunes, burning toll booths, they aren't doing it because they hate Macron. They're doing it because they live in these peripheral ghost towns where the only economic activity left is a supermarket and an Amazon warehouse. They are the casualties of the museum economy. While Paris sells handbags to tourists, the rest of the country is fighting for survival. And here's the data that should terrify you. Since June 2024, there have been 444 redundancy plans filed in France. That's 444 companies announcing mass layoffs. The CGT trade union, France's largest, documented 325 industrial site closures in that same period. They call it massive deindustrialization. Over 300,000 jobs are at long-term risk. 300,000. And this isn't just affecting factory workers, it's bleeding into the entire economy. Car sales in France dropped 27% in the first 10 months of 2025 compared to 2019. 27%. That's not a dip, that's a collapse. Now, the government will point to announcements. They'll tell you that 30.4 billion euros in industrial investments were announced in 2025. Sounds impressive, right? But here's what they won't tell you. Announcements are not reality. Factory closures are, and the closures are outpacing the openings by nearly 2-to-1. Despite all the press releases and ribbon-cutting ceremonies, the net industrial balance in the first half of 2025 was just 9 new sites. 9. Compare that to 48 in the prior 6 months. France is not reindustrializing. It's putting on a PR show while the factories continue to die. And here's the kicker. During the COVID pandemic, France realized in a panic that it didn't even have the capacity to manufacture paracetamol. The country that invented the vaccine, Pasteur, anyone, had to beg India and China for basic painkillers. That is the reality of a country that forgot how to build. France has become dependent on the rest of the world for the most basic goods. And when the next crisis hits, when supply chains break again, France will be helpless. It will be rich in handbags and poor in everything that actually matters. Now let's talk about what this means for the people living there. Because this isn't just about factories and GDP numbers. This is about your wallet, your future, your ability to survive. Let's play a game. Imagine you're a young French professional. You did everything right. You suffered through the classes preparatory. You got your master's degree. You speak decent English. You land a good job in a mid-sized city like Lyon or Bordeaux. You open your first paycheck and you stare at it. 1,740 euros net. That's the median salary in France as of 2025. That means half the population earns less than that. Now compare that to your friend who didn't go to college. Maybe they work as a cashier or a cleaner or an unqualified server. They're on the SMIC, the Salaire Minimum Interprofessionnel de Croissance, the minimum wage. As of 2025, the SMIC is around 1,800 euros gross, which comes out to about 1,500 euros net after taxes. Do you see the problem? The gap between surviving and middle class is a few hundred euros a month. In the US, the gap between a minimum wage worker and a median earner is massive. In France, it's a rounding error. This phenomenon has a name. Economists call it smicardization. It's the great flattening. Over the last 20 years, France has essentially compressed its wage structure into a pancake. Because the cost of labor is so high for companies, and we'll get to the taxes in a second. Oh boy, will we? Employers simply cannot afford to give raises. So, when the government raises the minimum wage to keep up with inflation, which they do aggressively, the bottom floor rises, but the ceiling stays where it is. The result? The floor is eating the room. Decades ago, only a small percentage of French workers were on minimum wage. Today, it's over 17% of the workforce. And for millions more, they're hovering just a few euros above it. Imagine the psychological toll of that. You study for 5 years. You take on stress. You manage a team. And you take home barely more than the guy stocking shelves. Why bother working harder? Why bother innovating? This isn't just an economic statistic. It's a motivation killer. It turns the entire country into a participation trophy, where the prize is barely being able to afford rent. Speaking of rent, if you think that 1,700 euros goes far, because healthcare is free, let me introduce you to the French real estate market. In Paris, a decent studio apartment, not a palace, a box where you can touch the fridge from your bed, costs between 1,200 and 1,500 euros a month. Do the math. On a median salary, living in the capital is mathematically impossible without roommates or rich parents. You aren't living in Paris, you're camping in it. Now, let's talk about the tax hellscape that makes all of this worse. If there's one thing France is world champion at, beating even Brazil in football, it's taxation. Let's go back to that paycheck. Remember the median salary? To get that money into your bank account, a financial murder scene had to take place first. Here's how it works. And if you're American, sit down, because this might induce vertigo. Let's say a company wants to hire you for a decent mid-level job. They're willing to spend 60,000 euros a year on you. That's the super brute, the total cost to the employer. First, the government takes a massive bite called employer contributions. Poof, gone. Now your gross salary, the number written on your contract, is about 43,000 euros. But wait, you don't get 43,000. Now, the government takes employee contributions for Social Security, retirement, unemployment, and so on. Another huge bite. Now, you're left with your net salary, roughly 33,000 euros. But we aren't done, because now you have to pay income tax on that net salary. By the time the money actually hits your pocket to buy groceries, nearly 50% of what your employer paid for your labor has vanished into the state coffers. France has the highest tax burden in the OECD. The government confiscates about 45 to 48% of the entire country's GDP in taxes and social charges every year. This creates a vicious cycle of poverty. Companies can't afford to pay high net salaries because the taxes on top are astronomical. Employees have no disposable income to spend, so the local economy stagnates. The government sees the stagnation and says, "We need more money to fix this," and raises taxes again. It's an economic boa constrictor. It squeezes slowly, and you don't realize you're suffocating until you try to save money at the end of the month and realize you can't. And God help you if you try to get rich. France has a cultural allergy to wealth. They literally had a solidarity tax on wealth for years that taxed you just for having assets, regardless of your income. It scared away thousands of millionaires. Macron replaced it with a real estate wealth tax, but the message remains. Success is suspicious. Please apologize for it by giving us half. Now, before you think, well, at least they get great public services for all those taxes, let me shatter that illusion too. The unspoken contract in France for decades was, we take half your money, but we give you world-class services. That contract is void. Visit a French emergency room today. You might wait 10, 12, sometimes 20 hours. There are medical deserts in rural France where you cannot find a GP to save your life. Doctors are retiring, and the quota system that kept the number of new doctors artificially low for decades is now showing its consequences. Look at the education system. French students used to be among the best in math. In the latest PISA rankings, France has dropped to the middle of the pack. Teachers are underpaid and demoralized. leading to a recruitment crisis where the government is hiring unqualified staff just to put warm bodies in classrooms. Look at the justice system. It's notoriously slow and underfunded. The tragedy is that the French are still paying luxury prices, high taxes, but receiving budget service. When the public sector fails, those with money opt out. They send their kids to private schools. They go to private clinics. They use private security. This creates a two-tier society. The rich insulate themselves from the decline, while the poor and the middle class are left with crumbling infrastructure. The égalité carved onto the front of the town halls is starting to look less like a promise and more like a cruel joke. But here's where it gets even darker. Because France isn't just bleeding money in factories, it's bleeding people. Its best people. If you walk into a Goldman Sachs office in London, a Google office in Zurich, or a research lab in Montreal, look at the badges. You'll see a shocking number of French names. France produces brilliant minds. The education system, specifically the elite Grandes Écoles, is fantastic at churning out world-class engineers, mathematicians, and financiers. But France cannot keep them. This is the brain drain, and it's bleeding the country dry of its most valuable resource, human capital. Imagine you're a top-tier AI researcher. Option A, stay in Paris, earn 45,000 euros a year, pay 50% in taxes, struggle to rent a 30-square-meter apartment, deal with a gloomy hierarchy where you wait 15 years for a promotion. Option B, move to California or Switzerland, earn $150,000 a year, pay lower taxes, live in a house, lead a team immediately. It's not a hard choice. Estimates suggest that between 2.5 and 3 million French citizens live abroad. But it's not a random sample. These are the risk takers, the entrepreneurs, the scientists. When the smartest people leave, innovation leaves with them. This is why there's no French Google or French Amazon. There are very few French tech giants created in the last 20 years. The founders left. They built Snowflake in the US. They built Moderna. The CEO is French in the US. France is effectively subsidizing the rest of the world. The French taxpayer pays for the expensive education of these geniuses. And then the US or UK economy reaps the profits of their labor. And it's getting worse. Youth unemployment in France hit 18.2% in 2024. And if GDP growth stays at 0.6%, that number is projected to hit 20% by 2027. 1 in 5 young people without a job. 1 in 5. These aren't lazy kids. These are graduates with degrees who can't find work because the economy isn't creating opportunities. So what do? They leave. And every time one of them buys a one-way ticket to London or Dubai, France loses a piece of its future. The country becomes a little grayer, a little slower, a little poorer. Now, let's talk about the pension system, because this is where the French delusion reaches its peak. You probably saw the news in 2023. Paris was burning, garbage was piled high in the streets. Riot police were charging through tear gas. Why? Was it a war? A coup? No. The government proposed raising the retirement age from 62 to 64. To the rest of the world, this looked insane. In Germany, the retirement age is heading to 67. In the UK and US, it's similar, but in France, asking people to work 2 more years was treated like a human rights violation. But here's the dark reality those protesters didn't want to admit. The French pension system is a demographic Ponzi scheme. It's a pay-as-you-go system. That means the money taken from your paycheck today isn't being saved for your retirement. It's being wired directly to a retiree right now. You're paying for your grandma's vacation in Nice. This system works great when you have 4 workers for every 1 retiree. That was France in the 1960s. Today, it's roughly 1.7 workers for every 1 retiree, and dropping. France is getting old. The baby boomers are retiring en masse, and the birth rate is not high enough to replace them. So, you have a shrinking pool of young underpaid workers, remember the smicardization, trying to support a growing army of retirees, who are living longer than ever. The math is brutal. It simply does not work. The system is bleeding billions of euros a year. Right now, the public pension deficit stands at 6.6 billion euros annually. But that's just the start. Projections show that deficit ballooning to 15 billion euros by 2035. 15 billion. Every single year. To plug the hole, the government has 2 choices. 1, cut pensions, political suicide. 2, raise the retirement age, political suicide, but slightly slower, so the country is stuck in a paralyzed state of denial. The young know they will probably never see a full pension, yet they're taxed to death to pay for the old. It's an intergenerational robbery that's making the working population poorer every single day. And the boomers in the streets burning cars because they might have to work until 64 are simply refusing to accept the math. They want the fantasy to continue, but the fantasy is bankrupt. So let's step back and look at the full picture. France is a country with 113% debt to GDP and rising. A country growing at 0.6% while its neighbors grow at 1.3%. A country closing twice as many factories as it opens. A country where the middle class earns barely more than minimum wage workers. A country where the best and brightest are fleeing. A country with a pension system bleeding billions. A country where interest payments on debt are about to eclipse education spending. This is not a wealthy country. This is a country living on borrowed time and borrowed money. The illusion of wealth is maintained by debt, and the social peace is maintained by spending money the state doesn't have. But here's the thing that should terrify you. France is not an anomaly. It's a preview. It's the canary in the coal mine for the entire West. Look at the symptoms. Aging population. France hit the demographic wall first. The US is 10 years behind. Deindustrialization. France gutted its factories faster, but the US Rust Belt is telling the same story. Debt addiction. France's 113% debt to GDP is shocking, but the US is racing to catch up, running trillion-dollar deficits in peacetime. Political polarization. The collapse of the centrist parties in France, socialists and Republicans are basically dead. And the rise of the extremes, Le Pen versus the far left, is a preview of the polarization tearing apart the US and UK. France is the laboratory. It's trying to maintain a 20th century standard of living with 21st century demographics and 19th century industrial thinking. If France collapses, if the bond vigilantes finally attack French debt, if the EU has to bail out the second largest economy in Europe, it won't just be a French problem, it will be a global financial cataclysm. It will be 2008, but with better wine and angrier rioters. French banks hold 600 billion euros in sovereign debt. If that goes bad, the entire European banking system could seize up. And unlike 2008, central banks have far less room to maneuver. Interest rates are already low. Debt is already high. There's no magic bullet left. So, when you look at France, don't just see a poor country, see a warning flare. See the future of any nation that spends beyond its means for 50 years. See what happens when the math finally stops working. Now, remember that number from the beginning. 82. 82 factory closures in the first half of 2025. I told you it was just the symptom. Now you understand the disease. France is a country that bet everything on the idea that you could have it all. A 35-hour work week, retirement at 62, free healthcare, free education, generous unemployment benefits. And they could for a while, as long as the economy kept growing, as long as the population stayed young, as long as the factories kept humming. But all three of those conditions have vanished. The economy is stagnating, the population is aging, and the factories are closing. 82 of them in just 6 months. That number is the sound of the future being liquidated, the sound of a country that can no longer afford its own promises. So, is France doomed? Is it destined to become a sprawling open-air museum where tourists throw coins at the natives? Not necessarily. France has bounced back before. This is a country that survived the 100 Years' War, the Revolution, 2 world wars, and occupation. There's a resilience in the French character, a stubbornness that shouldn't be underestimated. There are signs of life. The tech scene in Paris, Station F, is growing. There's a generation of young French people who are tired of the old dogmas, who want to work, build, and disrupt. They're fighting against the gravity of the system. But the math is relentless. The debt is real. The aging is real. The poverty of the middle class is real. France is currently living on borrowed time and borrowed money. The correction is coming. The only question is when. And for you, the lesson is simple. Don't let the postcard fool you. Don't let the luxury brands distract you. And most importantly, look at your own country's balance sheet, because the French disease is contagious, and you might already be infected. If you learned something today, if I shattered your Emily in Paris fantasy just a little bit, hit that like button. It helps more than a government subsidy. And drop a comment. Are you French and living abroad? Tell us why you left. I bet it's the taxes. See you in the next one.